Welcome to Adaptive Garden Planning, friends, and I am so delighted that you have joined me. So I'm Petra here for Vision Seeds, and sit back, relax, pour yourself some tea. I hope you've got a pen and paper close at hand. Take lots of notes. I'm about to share a ton of awesome information, and smile, you're doing this for you, and I hope that it surrounds you and everyone you love with so much abundance, perhaps even for generations to come. So without further ado, let's imagine ourselves 2 months from now. There are ripe tomatoes on the vine, the basil is heavenly, it's all in our kitchen with us along with a big bouquet of zinnias, and this is our lives, and it all begins with the tiniest little seeds that we're sowing today. And some we've already sown, like this tomato. And here is a wonderful analogy for you, friends, just as we begin, that I remind myself of constantly. And whether it's gardens or how to do webinars or anything else that we might endeavor to do, I constantly have to remind myself that if I want a tomato, I have to plant this little tiny tomato seed that looks nothing like a big juicy tomato. And I have to plant this seed, and it grows, it sprouts, it's green. That's not a tomato. Wait, to get the tomato, I have to grow the seed into a sprout and grow it under lights in my warm, cozy kitchen. And now we're hardening them off, about to plant them into the soil. And then I will be trellising them for at least 5-6 weeks before I even see a yellow flower that still, P.S. by the way, isn't a tomato. And only then, when it pollinates, do I get a tomato. And so I have to constantly remind myself, which is one of the reasons I love seeds and am such a student of them, why I constantly remind myself that seeds are such teachers, and that they've in fact always been, this tomato plant has always been the tomato, and I have always been the person that knows how to do webinars and knows how to garden. I just happen to adapt constantly and learn constantly and ask questions constantly and learn how to become a better me, a more delicious me, and a more delicious, more healthy, more abundant tomato along the way. But that I'm not inherently different from what I want. I just am cultivating myself at every step of the journey. So that I hope in those moments when you are feeling overwhelmed and that you just want to know how to do this and you already have this. And just knowing even to ask the question is so much of not the answer, but how to approach even deeper, richer questions. And doing this together is what brings me some of the greatest joy in my life. So now you know we're in this together, and I am delighted to join you on the journey, friends. So without further ado, let's dig in. Whether you've been gardening for years or dreaming for years, here we are. So I'm about to share a ton of information, some really basic, some not so basic, and lots of different disciplines all interwoven because it's all connected, right? Yes, and I'm excited to break each of these subjects down in blogs and webinars in all kinds of ways. But here is the big picture that we can all begin to dig into all at once. So as a general pathway for the next hour of our lives, I'm going to dig into kind of where to garden, and then we'll dive into soils, seeds, then we'll talk about when to sow, how to sow, so deceptively simple, and we'll talk about companion planting. We'll talk about weed management and how that relates to organic disease and pest management. We'll talk about succession sowing because I love to eat every day. And that is the primary way. And then we'll talk about taking notes, which is deceptively simple and difficult all at once. So without further ado, let's dive in. Where do you garden? Garden in full sun. Vegetables, flowers, the more sun, the more abundance. Think of sun, so quick fun facts. This marvelous green leaf, this is photosynthesizing sugars from the sun. It's absolute magic. So the more sun that you have, the more your plants can photosynthesize. We'll talk in the succession and sowing, and also in the companion planting, some little tweaks on that, because some plants, like lettuce for example, in the heat of summer prefer to have a little less direct sun. But as a general rule, if you want abundant vegetables or abundant flowers, full sun is what you want. And also, really rich, fertile soil makes all the difference. We'll talk about soil in a few minutes. You also want that soil to be well drained. Soil is a living, breathing medium, and just like we are exchanging gases and exchanging water in all of our cells incessantly, water is in our soil is the same way. So a stagnant, stinky swamp is its own special ecosystem and is notably not a vegetable garden. So make sure that your site, wherever you're choosing, has a full day of sun and is really well drained with the richest, most fertile soil that you can find, knowing that building soil is really the work of our lives, and that healthy soil translates into healthy crops, and that healthy crops, literally, plants have immune systems just like you and I. So a stressed plant is more susceptible, just like we are more susceptible to diseases and stress when we are stressed. And so one of the keys to organic disease and pest management is just simply to have phenomenal soil. And having phenomenal soil doesn't just happen. It works, it's every day, it's every year, and you have to actively be building soil, because otherwise it's really easy to just be extracting nutrients from the soil. We want to be returning more nutrients than in fact we're taking, which is totally a trick. So let's dig into soil now. Soil testing is so crucial, and I think of it this way. It's amazing to be on the Great Barrier Reef on a pontoon boat. And certainly there's lots of wonderful things to witness, but if you really want to see the inner workings of the Great Barrier Reef, you have to put a snorkel on your face and get down into the water and actually experience it. And so it's perfectly plausible and possible to have a really robust, beautiful, abundant, healthy garden without a soil test. But that being said, as soon as you test your soil, all of a sudden you've got your snorkel on and you're seeing exactly not only the pH, but all the other factors at play in what is creating your soil health, which is ultimately your plant health. So we test our soil every year, every single field, and pretty religiously. But of course, this is our job and deep, deep love. So you don't need to do it necessarily every year, although I highly recommend it. It costs just $20, and it's an encyclopedia of information. But I recommend at minimum every other year, so that way you can really stay ahead of the curve, because it's much easier. An ounce of prevention is a pound of cure, as they say, and certainly in soil testing, that is no exception. So yes, check out our blog on soil testing, and your local cooperative extension is your go-to source for an easy, inexpensive, and yet very comprehensive soil test. And you want to just be adding more fertility than you're ultimately taking. And so that can go in a lot of forms. So compost is amazing. Oh my goodness. Compost is its own whole scenario, and I can't wait to share a ton more about compost. But in the meantime, if you can get compost, incredible. We also have our Granular organic fertilizer. This is long-term, slow release. It has over 100 the key macronutrients and 100 micronutrients, including humates, so that it's actively building soil. And this bag covers 250 square feet. It's 5 pounds. And if you're container gardening, which we'll talk about a little bit too, container gardens, you want to put a quarter cup of this in every gallon of soil, really beautifully, evenly intermixed, so that the roots of your plants are inspired to go investigate every square inch of the soil in this container, and there's yummy, delicious food all season for them. So this is a wonderful way. We literally spread this on our farm by the ton. And worm castings, if you can find them, are another incredible source of nutrients as well as probiotics. They're alive. So it's adding incredible biology to your soil that just helps nutrient cycle in a way that's especially advantageous for vegetables and flowers. And honestly, leaves are one of your greatest go-tos, especially if you're here in the Northeast like we are. Deciduous trees, I'm looking at this hill behind me. Deciduous trees are what has built some of the most extensive soils on the planet since the last glacier and the last ice age. So those incredible deciduous leaves that fall every fall are such an incredible resource. So much carbon, but so many micronutrients. So it builds soil like very few other things. So there's a few awesome options. There's some other things, and we'll talk more about fish emulsion a little later, that approach like plant health. So fish emulsion is a wonderful way to feed your crops, but it's not necessarily feeding your soil. So there's a lot of different ways to think about soil and building your soil, and certainly compost, our granular fertilizer, worm castings, leaf mulch, key. Building your soil, feeding your soil as well as your crop. But something like fish emulsion is amazing, and don't leave home without it. We have 50-gallon barrels. But just know that it is feeding the crop rather than the soil itself. So other things to keep in mind when to work the soil, and this is so important. So here we are in spring. It's almost Memorial Day. It's been really cool and wet this year. Here in New York. Other years, 3 weeks ago, we were planting and like getting into our fields. So here's the thing, regardless of what kind of season there is, get yourself a shovel, dig a little hole 6 inches down, make a ball of soil. And with that ball of soil from 6 inches down, like the size of a ping pong ball, stand up and drop it from waist height. And when you drop it, if it doesn't fall into 1,000 pieces, your soil is too wet to work, whether it's with a rototiller or even turning over with a fork. And you're going to actually destroy soil structure and very much shoot yourself in the foot if you're turning soil and trying to work it when it's too wet. So as soon as that ping pong sized ball of soil from 6 inches beneath the surface, you drop it and it crumbles into 1,000 pieces, that's when you know that you can work the soil and you won't be doing your soil any vast disservice. That being said, no-till is totally a marvelous thing, which is a subject of another webinar that I'm so excited to share, because leaf mulching, lasagna gardening, the less we till, the better the planet is, without question. But a lot of us are still tilling our soil and will for some time. And so just know that if you're going to work it in any way, that is the quick, easy, awesome, such fun test to let you know whether it's time to work your soil yet or not. And yeah, so you can certainly use the best. And so soil, I just want to dive a little bit into organic pest and disease management ever so slightly before we jump back out. Because I can't talk about soil health without thinking about plant health. They're just interrelated to the extent that they are one and the same. A plant is only as healthy as the soil that it grows in. And some plants, just like each of us, have more innately robust immune systems. But that being said, holy heavens, there's nothing that can replace a quality diet in a human life, and there's nothing that can replace quality soil for plant life. And your number one best thing that you can do to prevent diseases and insects as well is to have just really nice, rich, incredible soil. Without question, when I'm looking over at all our potatoes and I'm noticing the first Colorado potato beetles, without question, they are on the potatoes that are the smallest, the most stressed. And when I'm looking at flea beetles that are on broccoli, without question, they find the ones that are most stressed and they eat that one first, similar to the hyenas and lions that are going after those most sick and elderly and the most vulnerable of the whatever large ruminant they're chasing across the African plains, they're going after the weakest links, and that is the easiest way. So that is the way that diseases and insects work as well. So increasing your overall plant health is your most phenomenal way to be increasing your resilience when it comes to organic pest and disease management. And I also wanted to just dive into briefly to watering, because watering goes such a long way in terms of soil health and also just plant health. So there's lots of different strategies of watering, but just keep in mind here in the Northeast, watering in the morning is better than midday and in the evening. In the midday, think of the sun going through water droplets. You can literally sunburn plants. So water droplets just magnify the intensity of the light of the sun. So anytime you can water in the morning and letting that excess humidity evaporate is phenomenal, not only in that leaves and tissues are not going to be sunburned. It also means, water is the primary vector for every disease on the planet. And so the more moisture, humidity that you have in your garden, the more susceptible it will be to diseases as well. So yes, watering a little goes a long way. I love drip tape, and soaker hoses are great, but if you can have them go down into the soil rather than up underneath the leaves, again, you'll be doing yourself that much more of a favor. But no matter how you approach watering, just be sure that your plants ideally want to live with an inch of water a week. And so you'll have to water more in hotter periods, less in cooler periods. And a little goes a long way, and in the morning is absolutely critical. So let's talk about seeds, because seeds make all the difference. And certainly I'm biased. And let me tell you a little bit about my bias. So my name is Petra, Petra Page Mann, and I grew up in my father's garden. In fact, 10 miles that way. And so when I was a little girl, we would grow watermelons every few years. And I was always so excited, because who doesn't love growing, or at least eating, watermelon? But every year we would grow the watermelon, and it would be a big viney octopus, and then we'd get a few little watermelons that were very disappointing and not that delicious. And every time I'd be like, oh shoot, I'm sorry, Dad, that was a waste of garden space. And I've never been a practical person ever. So for me to say that was a waste of garden space is a serious waste of garden space. So I thought that watermelons were not realistic to grow here in Zone 5 in the Finger Lakes of New York. So fast forward, I start living on a farm in Maine. It's 2002, and we're growing Sugar Baby and Cream of Saskatchewan watermelon, and all of a sudden it's like the end of July, beginning of August, and we're eating tons of watermelons, and I'm like, whoa, what's going on? This is an even shorter season than what I grew up with. But here's the thing, most seeds are in the last century have been selected for hot, arid climates, i.e. the Central Valley of California and kind of Florida, where the vast majority of produce is grown to be shared all across the continent. So if you live in Florida and if you live in the Central Valley of California, don't worry. You've got lots of choices for regionally adapted seeds, from every big box store to every other seed company. But if you live in anywhere else, all of a sudden, your seeds are not nearly as adapted. So that's what I learned growing watermelons when I was a little girl. I thought we couldn't grow them here, and lo and behold, we can. We just need well-adapted seeds. So, which is all to say, regional adaptation makes all the difference. And just because a seed company is local doesn't mean they're growing their own seeds. So definitely look into companies and see where they're actually sourcing their seeds. And I'd love to list off just a few of my favorites. So True Love Seeds in Philadelphia, amazing. Uprising Seeds in Bellingham, Washington, incredible. Wild Garden Seed, Adaptive Seeds, Siskiyou Seeds, and I love Turtle Tree. Love, love, love Turtle Tree. And I love High Mowing, Johnny's, and Fedco as well. They're predominantly distributors, but they have phenomenal seeds as well. So I could go on and on, but that is the long and short. Oh, and I love Hudson Valley, a seed company as well. But be sure to ask your seed companies where their seeds are coming from. And in full disclosure, Fruition Seeds, we grow about 70% of our own seed. Another 20% is grown by other organic seed growers around the Northeast. And then the balance is grown by small seed growers in the West that have better climates for things like spinach and carrots and beets. And these are things that we can grow very easily just vegetatively here, but as seed crops, the quantity and quality of seed that our friends there are able to produce is much, much greater. So yes, ask your seed companies where their seeds come from, and you will learn so much. So yeah, I want to just speak for a moment too about why organic seeds make a big difference as well. So I loved when Klaus Martens, an amazing organic farmer, grain grower here in the Finger Lakes, once said, well, Petra, when do you start raising a child? And that's a question that he had learned from his neighboring Mennonite communities. And the Mennonites have this question, when do you start raising a child? And in their worldview, a child has started everything that's raising a child the last century. Everything that's happened 100 years up until the child is born is actively raising that child. So yes, how we leave, we are becoming the ancestors for every species of every generation yet to come. So becoming good ancestors and remembering to be good ancestors is such a primary way that I love to remember why I'm doing what I'm doing, whether it's seed saving, growing food, sharing food, everything. So organic seeds come from organic plants, and organic plants, of course, haven't been sprayed with Roundup, any other pesticides, herbicides. Their root systems have to forage in the soil for nutrients. They don't just have the miracle NPK manna from heaven of Miracle-Gro waiting for them. So they have actual immune systems as well. So in the same way that your health is related to the health of your great-great-great-grandmother, and that's why it's the last century that's been grazing you from the moment you were born. Same is true for plants. So the more we can invest in organics and organic systems, especially plants bred in organics for organics, all of a sudden it makes gardening so much easier. Like, oh, what? These plants know how to compete with weeds. Oh, they know how to forage in the soil for nutrients. Oh, they have strong immune systems. Immunity is hereditary. So yes, these are just a few of the reasons why organic seeds matter. Even if, it's a flower seed and you're not planning on eating the seed or even what the seed grows. So yes, that is just a tiny, tiny tip of that iceberg. And also in terms of seeds, sow what you love. Sow what do you love? Like, what do you sow? Well, yes, organic, regionally adapted seeds, but sow what you love. I can't tell you how many people are like, well, I guess I should grow kale. And I'm like, wait. Do you like kale? Only grow what you're actually going to love eating, because if you don't love eating it, probably you're not going to love weeding it and all of the other things entailed before you actually get to eat it. So I find for myself that literally dangling the carrot of you'll have a carrot to eat is so important if I like carrots. So don't feel pressured to grow everything in the world or things that are a popular vegetable. Just grow, sow what you love and love what you sow. Grow it for you, friends. So yes, let's talk now about when to sow seeds. So if you haven't already seen it, perhaps you have seen this already. We have this lovely planting calendar, and it's a postcard size planting calendar that if you've ordered from Fruition Seeds, you're like, oh yeah, that came in my order. And if you're about to receive seeds from Fruition Seeds, you're about to receive one in your order. And if you order from us in the future, you will receive one. If you don't ever want to order from us and you're here listening to my webinar, all of a sudden, that's fine, wonderful. You can just go on our garden planning blog and download it for free. You never even have to purchase from us. You can also get our direct sow charts and our transplant, a bunch of other awesome downloads to help you plan your garden, and our garden planning guide in our blog. So don't be shy, hop on over. There's lots of ways to get this awesome calendar that shares, there's lots of different colors and lots of different crop types, lots of other symbols. So this is a baby encyclopedia of when to sow. And this is a planting calendar relevant for zones 4 through 6, by the way. If you're colder or warmer, you can add 2 weeks for every zone, and that'll be pretty approximately marvelous for you. And yeah, when to sow makes all the difference. And it depends on the latitude. There's lots of different zones. So take a look at the USDA garden zone maps and know that they're changing. But like, for example, we're here in zone 5 here in Fruition Seeds in the Finger Lakes. And elevation makes a big difference as well. Like, we have 5 different farms here at Fruition, and they all have different elevations and soil types. And it's amazing how different they all are. So yes, we actually have 3 weeks of a longer season on our lowest elevation farm compared to our highest elevation farm where we are now. So yes, ecotones, elevation, they make all the difference. So don't take anything anyone says for granted, especially things like frost dates, because a lot of these zones are centered around when is the final frost in spring and the first frost in fall. And know that that can be wildly variable. In fact, so for us here in zone 5, it's around Memorial Day. And it can be 2 weeks earlier. It can also be 10 days, 2 weeks later. So there's a solid month around that frost date where, wow, be prepared and plan on not knowing. And think of here, I want to share some keys around what is important about that frost date, especially your spring frost date, because there are cold hardy plants that don't mind being frosted, and there are cold sensitive plants that not only don't want to be frosted at 32 degrees, they don't want to experience 50 degrees. They're like, what? We're tropical and we're north of the Mason-Dixon line? We didn't sign up for this. So, pardon my personification of plants. So, knowing your frost date and knowing what plants can adapt around the frost date makes all the difference. So, I want to show you a few of the plants that don't mind growing around frost. So, certainly there are peas. And peas, you can plant as soon as the soil can be worked in spring. There are full-size peas and dwarf peas, shelling peas, snow peas, snap peas. And yes, they don't mind growing in the cold. In fact, they are sweetest and most tender in the cold. Peas in the fall are my favorite. We'll talk about succession sowing, don't worry. And yes, so here's a dwarf pea, Laxton's Progress, love it. Swiss chard is quite cold hardy, doesn't mind, and that's the same exact genus species as beets. So those you don't want to plant as soon as something like peas, where peas, literally, if your crocus are coming up, you can plant them. They're not going to germinate as quickly. Warmer soils have seeds germinate much more quickly. So like a pea, its optimum germination temperature is around 75 degrees, but it can totally still germinate in 40-degree temperatures. It just means that it might take 2 weeks for it to germinate. So yes, I wait for more like 3-4 weeks, 1 month before final frost to sow our beets and Swiss chard. And spinach is another quality choice for early, right there with the peas, first thing. With spinach, also cilantro can go in first thing, arugula and radish, also Asian spinach. So yes, and who knew? Yeah, cilantro, let me just say that again. Cilantro loves to grow in the cold. Who knew? It actually doesn't love growing in the heat of summer. It just gets really stressed. You've probably noticed that it bolts, that it gets really tall and flowers and isn't nearly as delicious in the heat of summer when it bolts. So spring, it actually overwinters for us uncovered in the field when we plant it in September. So yes, don't underestimate the cold hardiness of, of a cilantro. Broccoli rabe is another awesome choice for spring and fall. Loves growing in the cold and endives and radicchios all day long. And yes, arugula. And we actually have this wintergreen mesclun mix that our friend Dan Brisbois up in Tournesol, Montreal, Tournesol Seeds in Montreal, he's been selecting this for like a decade at least to regrow quickly in cold temperatures. So there are just a few of the things that, even if you can plant as soon as the soil is worked / a few weeks later, a month easily before it actually stops frosting. So it can take really cold soils and even snow. Like these peas have had 3 inches of snow fall on them in the last 6 weeks. And there they are. They were actually looking kind of not great 10 days ago, but they've bounced back amazingly. So those are the crops that no matter how cold it is, they're going to be just fine. So honestly, as we're talking about adaptive garden planning and how to prepare for seasons not being consistent and our climate changing, those are the crops that in spring are going to be so reliable, and they're going to thrive no matter if the frost is really early, really late, or just on time. And again, there can be a month in between those periods. So plants that that are much more picky, that are frost sensitive, think of them not as frost sensitive, but as cold sensitive. So again, like this tomato is frost sensitive. 32 degrees, it's going to die. But it's way more effective to actually think about it as cold sensitive, because if this tomato experiences less than 50-degree temperatures, it's just so sad, and we'll get really stressed. And tomatoes bounce back much more quickly than tomatoes and eggplants and tomatillos and ground cherries. But that being said, it still doesn't love it, and you're actually shooting yourself in the foot. So especially here in our short seasons, we think, wow, we have a short season. We need to get this in the ground as quickly as possible and get it to fruit. Please, quick now. Winter is coming. But if the soil is cold, and the nights are going to be cold, that plant is going to be stressed. And it's actually going to grow faster, healthier, more robustly if we are planting it a little later, but into warm soil, and when the nights are that much warmer. And then its growth can just be this more steady 90-degree growth curve instead of this like, can we hack it? Okay, baby. Okay. So trust me, it's really hard. Do as I say and not as I do. Sometimes we still jump the gun and plant things too early. But if you can wait until, not only the last frost, but for the nights to be consistently out of the 40s into the 50s, your frost sensitive, i.e. cold sensitive plants will be that much more happy. So just a few thoughts on when to sow. One final thought in that department, I want to talk about hardening off. So hardening off is so critical, and it's the acclimation period of taking this tomato that has lived its life in our cozy greenhouse, in your cozy kitchen, and all of a sudden it has to survive in this dynamic world. And what is that? It's a breeze. Oh, what? And water falls from the sky and temperatures fluctuate? What is this? It's very stressful to go from life in your cozy coddled greenhouse / kitchen to going out into your garden. So letting your plant thoroughly translate and acclimate for 4 to 6 days is the ideal hardening off period, an acclimation period. And so you're taking them outside. You're gradually increasing their light, ideally from 4 hours day one, increasing 2 hours every day, more or less, until they're experiencing full day sun, because plants sunburn, just like my Polish nose. And also, you're not watering them unless they're bone dry. Ideally, they're getting some water from the rain and just getting to know what that experience feels like. And they're getting to experience temperature fluctuations. So you can harden them off under, you can see behind me, there are some hoops with floating row cover over them, and check it. So that is a wonderful way to transition them as well. And we have these wonderful hoops. It's spring steel, and which is just amazing. I don't understand it really as an alloy, but like metal, generally, when it only bends so much and then it just breaks. But this spring steel is super springy and amazing, and we've had these since we started Fruition Seeds in 2012. And they're still going strong. You can bend them into all different configurations, and they're perfect for letting that light row cover sit right over it. And you can just tuck a few inches in the ground, and then lay your row cover right over it. And row cover is an amazing substance. I mean, it's spun polyester, so it's totally, pardon. Bless me. So, floating row cover is vastly different than your bed sheet. So it lets in actual UV photosynthetic light so that your plants can actually photosynthesize, where your bed sheet looks a lot like floating row cover, but in fact doesn't let a lot of the UV and other photosynthetic wavelengths through. And so you're really effectively starving your plants, which bed sheets are wonderful for things like, it's gonna frost and let's just throw bed sheets on and it'll be great, or at least better than it would be otherwise. And you're not wrong, but that's just for an overnight kind of baby crisis, not for, let's harden off plants and keep plants cozy. It's like a little baby greenhouse. It's wonderful for season extension and diving into organic disease and pest management. This is amazing stuff too. If I imagine cucumber beetles and flea beetles, and cucumber beetles especially, they can go in and just, they themselves, their little munchings aren't the biggest deal. They aren't that big a stress for plants, but they do leave gaping open wounds on your cucumbers, watermelon, winter squash, summer squash, and those open wounds can very quickly become secondary infections of other diseases. So the more you can protect your crops from flea beetles, from cucumber beetles, the better that they're going to grow. And honestly, once they've started to flower, if they haven't had a single bite from a cucumber beetle, your zucchini are going to be A-okay and sail off into the sunset. It's just when they're small, sensitive plants and they're having to fend with all of these munchings from cucumber beetles that really makes the difference. So these hoops and floating row cover are incredible, super simple tools to making organic gardening easier and more successful, and certainly more adaptive. So now let's talk about how to sow. And so, wow, there's just so much to share. Begin with the end in mind. And that can be hard because if you've never grown a garden, you don't necessarily know how much space a plant needs. But when I say, Stephen Covey, when he said, begin with the end in mind, he's like, how do you imagine what's going to be and then build that capacity? So it's having the imagination of, this tomato plant is really small, but it's going to get huge. And so is this tomato plant. And even though they're really small right now and we want to have a big, abundant garden and kind of fit a lot of things in, how about we just plant these a foot away from each other? You're going to be asking for a lot of trouble because they're going to be competing for light above the ground, nutrients below the ground. Their overlapping leaves are going to make that much more competition for stress, but humidity, so that is going to harbor extra insects and diseases that you don't want them to harbor, which is all to say, you want to plant your tomatoes at least 2 feet apart. Even 2.5 feet, honestly, is the dream. So you want to begin with the end in mind and take a look at our packets. So our packets say, plant spacing. So Fruition Seeds packets, yes, lots of information. Growing instructions on the back. There's this handy side tab. So you can see here, plant spacing after thinning is one of those metrics that we share. In the case of this beautiful patty pan summer squash, it says 2 feet. So that means you want to have 2 feet in between each of your plants. And so, for example, with a patty pan, with a summer squash or winter squash, I want to have them every 2 feet, I would plant just 2 seeds every 2 feet. I'd thin it down to the strongest one, and that way, you've plenty of space in between. And we'll talk about interplanting and companion planting in a moment. And oh man, I can't wait, because there's so much to share with that, because there's a lot of space, a gap in between your 2 feet between your zucchinis and your 2.5 feet between tomatoes. And that's when you just plop in, a gorgeous little lettuce in between. But let me not get ahead of myself. So begin with the end in mind, and even if you've never planted a seed before in your life, all this information is available on our website, and certainly if you have our seed packets, you can very easily help yourself out by looking at how much space is required in between plants, in between rows, within the row and between rows, and that will help you, even if you've never sown before, get that plant spacing right from the beginning. And I always love to get a pen and get a piece of paper, really get a pencil, because you're probably going to be erasing if you're anything like me, and just play. And so you've got, your 4x8 raised bed, you've got your container, you've got your 30x30 garden, or your 300x300 garden. And so plan it out. And so, taking a look at what is this plant spacing row and plant spacing in between rows and within the row, and really starting to just flesh that out, envision it, and play. And think also about height. On our website, on our blog, and on many of our packets, you'll find the plant height as well. So things to keep in mind with that, some plants will get really tall, like tomatoes, and so it will shade other things. Some of those things can actually be behooved by that shade. For example, basil and lettuce. It can actually help those plants not bolt as quickly in the heat of the summer. But otherwise, you want to be thinking, like, who wants full light, and what height are they going to be, and what size? So yes, check out on some resources below in the webinar. I'm really excited to share with you some of our garden plans, and just some of my drawings and some of my friend Sal's drawings, because there's no one way to do it, and having fun with that is one of the key ways to just learn and play and experiment before you commit to putting a single seed in the ground. So another thing to keep in mind is whether you direct sow or transplant. And a lot of it depends on what your soil is, and what your soil looks like, and what you're trying to sow. So some things you sow directly in the ground, other things only want to be transplanted, and others you have a choice. So let's bring back out our old friend patty pan and take a look on the back. It will say transplant only on that back tab. And if it's something like this beautiful brandy-wise tomato, it will say transplant only. Other things will say, for example, this arugula says direct sow or transplant. You've got options. So certainly for the direct sow crops, you just want to direct sow them. For the transplant crops, sincerely, you just want to transplant them. But for those in between, here's the way that I think about it. If you have a great seed starting setup indoors, you can save yourself a lot of weeding by starting them indoors and planting them out. if you don't have a great seed starting setup, i.e. a grow light, a heat mat, and lots of time that you're indoors naturally just looking at them, like if you're away a lot, I highly recommend, away from your home a lot, I highly recommend simply direct sowing right in the ground. So direct sowing right in the ground, your weeds are starting to grow the moment that you open up that ground, and certainly the moment that you're planting those seeds. So yes, you generally do a lot more weeding when you direct sow. But sometimes that is a small price to pay for not having stressed, leggy, unhealthy transplants that you're planting in the ground. So there's a few things to keep in mind. And I just wanted to run through a quick laundry list of everything that is critical to be direct sown in the ground, because so many people try to transplant these, and it's just one of the common mistakes to avoid, friends. And it's counterintuitive. You totally can transplant everything that I'm about to share with you, and they can totally survive. But they will thrive more directly sown. They have sensitive root systems for a variety of reasons. And so the more they can just be sown and stay where they're sown and grow where they're sown, they will be that much more healthy, that much more abundant as a direct result. So, and it's counterintuitive again, because like we have a short season and you want to get the earliest abundance possible, but it's counterintuitive. For 7 years in a row, I actually planted zucchini seeds and a 10-day-old transplant and a 20-day-old transplant all the same day. And I stopped doing this experiment because I was like, I just couldn't believe that the seed would produce first and more every time. And with one exception, it didn't produce first, but it still produced way, way more ultimately. So I've stopped doing that experiment because I don't need to do that anymore for me. But I highly recommend if you're incredulous. I love you. Critical gardeners are curious gardeners. Curious gardeners are the best gardeners. And yes, do that experiment for yourself. And so here are all the things, just a quick laundry list of things that you definitely, please direct sow and resist transplanting whenever you can. So yes, summer squash, and winter squash certainly, and corn, any cucurbit. So also, watermelons and cantaloupe, but corn, any of your corn, heavens, they hate being transplanted. Oh yes, here's our watermelon friend, and any root vegetable. So carrots, beets, any turnip, radish, peanuts also don't like being transplanted. That goes for peas as well as beans. Here's another lovely root vegetable, and watermelon radish, just a fall radish, not a spring radish. They are much better off direct sown. And yes, here's another lovely little radish. And cucumbers, yes. Beets, absolutely. Sunflowers, who knew? Sunflowers don't love to be transplanted. They love to be direct sown whenever possible. They'll get, especially if you're looking for the tallest sunflowers in your life. I know, it's counterintuitive, but sincerely, resist transplanting them. They'll be that much more tall. And if you want the tallest sunflowers, just give them tons and tons of fertility. So give them, literally grow them on your compost pile, or give them a shovel full of compost. And yeah, they will know all the difference. So there you have it, friends. And a final piece of how to sow. Think outside the row. You don't always have to just sow in rows, friends. And that is, so certainly when it comes to container gardening, I love to just create a carpet. So if this was, I've planted a number of different lettuces in a grid here, and grid patterns, so imagine like a dice, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like that grid pattern really maximizes the surface area, and you can grow a lot more in that grid context than in straight rows if they were all parallel. So, but if this was lettuce mix, for example, I would just sow this not in rows at all, but just an entire carpet of lettuce mix, or like baby cilantro, baby basil, whatever it is. Just here it is, this entire carpet of turnips, of radish, of carrots, because there's no need. You only need space in rows if you're going to be weeding along those rows. So depending how you're weeding, planting, and we'll get to weeding in a few minutes. That makes all the difference for your strategies on how you're going to sow in the row. So now let's talk about companion planting. So companion planting. Tomatoes love basil. Carrots love dill. Is it really that simple? Yes, and so certainly there is a science to it a little bit. It's mostly an art. And I think of companion planting as breaking it down into 3 main categories. And the overarching theme is this: you're planting your garden and you want to have everything growing in such a way that it actually enjoys each other's company and isn't out competing each other and discrediting each other and discouraging each other. So as a general rule with companion planting, the more the merrier. More species, more diversity, more flowers, more insects, pollinators, more joy, more abundance. So yes, more the merrier in companion planting. And here are the key things. There's height and light considerations. There's kind of interplanting space efficiency. And then there's the pest and disease management where the science seriously comes in. So let's break all those down a little bit. So height and light. So there are some plants that can act like a living trellis. So corn and sunflowers can trellis pole beans brilliantly. Think and honor our indigenous ancestors who knew this times 1,000. So they were planting extensive polycultures, classic 3 sisters, the corn, the beans, the squash. The corn is growing upright, trellising the beans. The beans are fixing nitrogen that's feeding the corn, and the squash is just mulching the entire situation, a living mulch, maintaining nutrients and moisture. So it's an amazing polyculture. So yes, some plants can be living trellises, so keep that in mind. And also tall plants can shade smaller plants, and so that can not be great, but it also can be awesome. For example, lettuce, many lettuces will bolt in summer heat, and so knowing which plants will bolt in the summer heat, you can certainly choose bolt resistant lettuces. Whoa, do it. My favorite is the Gros Blanc Purses, which I've totally butchered the French accent, but it's a French heirloom, huge butterhead lettuce that's a little more loose, that is just luscious. And Optima and romaines often have great bolt tolerance. So choosing great summer lettuces is awesome, but also you can simply grow them in the shade of your tomatoes, in the shade of your sunflowers. And growing in the shade, they won't get as much sunlight exposure, they won't get as much heat, and that way they won't bolt or go to seed as quickly. So those are some height and light considerations for companion planting. There's also just space efficiency, like interplanting, and this is so much fun and really where the art comes in, because you can be so creative. We're growing salad mix on the edge of these peas growing up, and that's where dwarf kale in between leeks is brilliant, and planting spinach in the spring in between your garlic is awesome. And I love to plant a row of carrots, planting 6 inches, every 6 inches in the row, a radish. So then I know the radishes germinate at a fraction of the time the carrots do, so I can be weeding right where the carrots are well before the carrots even emerge. So that's weeding carrots is often one of the biggest struggles. So those radishes popping right up and allowing you to just weed alongside them really makes all the difference for a quality carrot crop. So yes, space efficiency makes all the difference. And pest and disease management is kind of the third and final frontier of companion planting, and where more science comes in, because for example, marigolds, every cell of a marigold plant, from its flower to its leaf to its root, is full of compounds that a lot of not beneficial nematodes don't love. So there's lots, I just want to go on the record saying there's a lot of phenomenal nematodes out there. Most of them are, but the ones that aren't give nematodes a really bad rap. But luckily, a lot of the not so beneficial nematodes for our garden plants really don't like the compounds that are naturally existing and in fact being exuded by the roots of marigolds. So marigolds are just phenomenal anyway because they're full of flowers which are bringing all kinds of beneficial pollinators in, and so I love tucking those Queen Sofia marigolds. So we have kind of 4 categories of our go-to companion plants that I'll share with you now. And Queen Sofia is number 1 because she's a scant foot tall and wide, amazing, covered in flowers. So she just fits everywhere, in containers, on the sides of beds, on the ends of beds, in between broccoli, and she's just full of flowers, basically from early July all the way till frost. And the more you pick her flowers, the more she'll just keep flowering. So many marigolds are much taller, which is awesome and beautiful, but in terms of companion planting and space efficiency, that's where that Queen Sofia is marvelous. And if you haven't already planted her, you totally can, even though it's almost Memorial Day. She'll flower a little bit later, but it's not too late. It's definitely final call, but it's definitely not too late to start now. And our number 2 is Calendula. So although Queen Sofia is this foot tall, foot wide, Calendula is 2 feet tall and 2 feet wide. So it's not quite as space efficient, but it's still pretty darn space efficient. So we, again, tuck it on the ends of beds and just love having them all around. And they grow so well in containers. So many blossoms, and they're edible and medicinal as well. So yeah, they're an amazing companion plant. And then just your herbs are phenomenal companion plants. A lot of those aromatics that make them so delicious to us actually attract beneficial insects that we humans consider beneficial, and then deter not beneficial pest insects according to our human, psyches and strategies. So culinary herbs, whether it's basil, thyme, oregano, sage, chives, anything in the allium family with all of their sulfur compounds, attract lacewings and ladybugs and all of these beneficial insects. And just add diversity to your lives. And they're, as a general rule, very disease resistant as well. So they're just a phenomenon, and they're relatively small, many of them, so they can interplant really effortlessly and beautifully. And the final department is the fourth, starting with our Queen Sofia marigold and calendula, and then herbs, especially short and quick growing herbs, and then alliums. So anything in the allium family, which includes onions and scallions, leeks, shallots, garlic, they're full of sulfur compounds, among others. But those sulfur compounds, again, tend to attract very beneficial insects and deter non-beneficials. So, and they also tend to be very, thin in their foliage, so they don't outcompete in terms of light. So which makes them amazing interplanting companion plants. So I love to tuck scallions here and there and everywhere, and chives as well. And interplanting between garlic in the spring is a really cool strategy too. You can lift back the mulch, and amazing. So yeah, there is just so much more to share in the companion planting department. We have a whole blog on it, but there are some keys for you, friends. And now, weed management. So let's talk. There are annuals, there are biennials, there are perennials, and knowing what you've got on your hands makes all the difference when it comes to knowing how to manage your weeds. And why are we managing our weeds? Besides the fact that they can just be annoying, and if one pigweed goes to seed, it can make easily 50,000 plus seeds that can stay in your soil for up to 30 years, like 3 decades, 30 years. So that's a long time. So the more you can manage your weeds, the more abundant your garden will be. So yes, keeping it simple is really important and is not necessarily easy. So knowing at the beginning of the season what your strategy is for making sure that you've got a plan for your weeds will make your life that much easier. So So let's talk about the strategies, and then we'll talk about annuals, biennials, and perennials. So mulch is amazing. If you're planning on mulching, of course, all strategies have their advantages, all strategies have their disadvantages. And then advantages are not always advantages, and disadvantages are not always disadvantages. But in terms of weeding and mulching, you've got lots of different options. So the advantages of mulch, of course, are that you retain soil more readily. You retain moisture more readily. You suppress weeds in the meantime. Amazing. But the downfall of them is that if you have lots of voles or chipmunks, they love to live and like thrive under, with the more of the mulch you have, the more they're going to be right at home. The same is true for slugs. And then of course, once you have mulch as well, you've committed to hand weeding. There's no way that you can break out your hoe and just weed a bunch really efficiently all at once. You're committing to pulling every single weed that comes through the mulch, which isn't the best, but it isn't the worst. And it is not the worst. So, but knowing these things from the outset is part of how you can adapt and become a gardener that is just better able to set yourself up for success. So a few of the things that I love to use as mulch: straw. If you can get seed-free straw, that's a miracle, but it's amazing, and do it. Weed-free straw is amazing. If you can get hay, awesome, but it tends to have a lot of weed seeds in it. Straw in general just tends to have seeds in it too, not so much weed seeds, but the rye, the grain itself, or the wheat, or the oats, whatever grain that grew the straw. Generally there's some weeds in it too. So in our garlic, we tend to be weeding winter wheat out of our straw, out of our garlic. But if you have lots of leaves, that's amazing. And yeah, make sure that you are not just like putting straight leaves on your garden, but if you can send them through a chipper shredder, amazing. And then there's this wonderful thing. It's kind of crazy, and I love it, don't love it, but it's called Biotella, and it's essentially, it's corn turned into a product that looks very much like black plastic, and you can lay that over your bed, bury the edges, or just solidify the edges, and then you can poke holes in it, and it really is an amazing mulch that warms up the soil so fast, and that is very effective at suppressing weeds, maintaining moisture. So Biotella is a really amazing tool as well. That, again, everything has its advantages and its disadvantages, but it's just another tool in your toolbox, friends. So I'm so excited to share with you these little tips on mulch. And now let's talk about the weeds themselves, and then I'll talk a little bit about hoes. So there are annual weeds, biennial weeds, and perennial weeds. Annual weeds are those that go to seed, from seed to seed in 1 year. Biennials take 2 years to go from seed to seed. And then perennials generally make seed every year, but they come back year after year instead of dying like annuals do after one season. So it depends how you weed these plants makes all the difference. So something like a biennial, they form a really deep taproot first things first. Like burdock is a classic biennial, and you can just go ahead and, like, here's our favorite Japanese hand hoe, like strip the leaves off the top and just come along with a hoe and take the leaves off. But there's tons of energy in that deep taproot that they've been setting, so they very quickly just jump back out of the soil. So in the case of biennials, getting a trowel and actually lifting up that root is your best bet for actually eradicating that weed. Same is true for perennials. Although they don't tend to have as deep of root systems, they just are really adept at being mown down and then coming back, because that's what they've had to do to adapt with the ruminants, like bison, for example, that they've been evolving with for countless millennia. So yes, getting rid of the root systems are really key. With things like annual weeds, like lamb's quarters and pigweed, simply taking the apical bud off of them is all you need to kill them. They generally don't have that robust of root systems, especially if they're young. So just taking off the the apical bud and the stem is all you need. So here's the thing, most people way overthink weeding. I want to show you this little tip, because the weeding at the thread stage is amazing. So the thread stage is this, where imagine my finger is a weed, and it'll be likely much smaller than my finger, but the root is only established to the extent that it looks like a single thread. It's so tiny, nowhere near established. And at that point, the stem is also really thin, really small. They're pretty short. And when I go in, I pretend my finger is the weed and the base of my hand is the soil. I'm coming in with a really sharp hoe, like this beautiful Japanese hand hoe that we share. And I just quickly chop it, just like right here above the soil. As soon as I'm weeding the soil itself and turning over the soil, there are all those weed seeds that weren't at the surface that now are suddenly at the surface, that are now suddenly germinating. And you're getting more weeding for yourself. So as much as you can weed these annual plants and these annual weeds by just clipping off the uppermost, their stem and apical bud, that way you're getting rid of the weed. You're not bringing more weeds up by disturbing the soil. And isn't that the best of both worlds? Yes, yes, and yes. So you're welcome. There's lots of different strategies. Hand hoes are awesome, but we have lots of standing hoes. Let's talk about tools in another webinar. But in the meantime, they're weeding at the thread stage is the dream of the dream. But again, that is most potent for weeds in their thread stage, especially annual weeds. So I think there's always so much more to share, but let's move on from weed management into succession sowing. And we are drawing toward the end, friends. Don't worry. And don't worry, this is far from the end. Hopefully we'll have the rest of our lives to be learning and laughing and sharing together. So without further ado, succession sowing, because you can't just plant lettuce once and be expecting to be harvesting lettuce 6 months from now. And so if you want to be harvesting vegetables like carrots and peas and lettuce and cilantro and cucumbers, bush beans all season long, you don't simply plant them once. You plant them in succession, different successions of them, which is why we call it succession sowing. And so I'm excited to share with you a few of my favorite crops to succession sow. And really they fall kind of into 3 main, or kind of 4 key, especially like mid-July on. There's kind of the greens, and then there's bush snap beans, greens and bush snap beans, and then quick growing herbs, and then roots like beets and carrots, and then cucumbers and zucchinis as well. So those are the kind of broad categories, and now I'll go through them a little bit more in depth, but just a tiny bit, because I know your time is precious. But laundry lists, here we come. So greens, the good news is there are lots of options. The bad news is you're talking about succession sowing over the summer, so you want to be making sure that they're heat tolerant, i.e. bolt tolerant. So things like spinach, mosh, really out of the question. And you can grow things like cooler season lettuces. Just make sure, again, you're interplanting them and putting them, for example, in the shade of a much taller, for example, tomato or sunflower. So here are a few greens that we succession sow because we love them. They're easy to grow, and you can very easily grow them in the sun or in the shade of other vegetables depending on the season. So arugula, yes, and basil, another awesome choice. Cilantro, amazing, yes. And now let's talk about beans, because you can plant multiple successions of bush snap beans, because they have a more concentrated harvest than your pole beans. Pole beans you want to just plant once. Basically, pretty much now is when it's Memorial Day here in Zone 5. We're planting our warm season crops, beans, good to go. But your pole beans, that's when you're good to put them in. you can be planting 2-3 successions of bush beans and you'll have that much more abundance. So every 3 weeks we're planting additional bush snap beans until like the second, third week in July here in Zone 5. Leeks are another wonderful thing to succession sow and interplant. Lettuces are phenomenal, and this new red fire is a fantastic summer lettuce. Also, Optima, Grossblond Perceuse, romaines are fantastic for summer. And this is my favorite romaine, flashy troutback. This winter density lettuce I just love, and ironically, I mean, it's called winter density. It's phenomenal for short seasons, but intriguingly, it's also very bolt tolerant. So it's actually, ironically, one of my favorite for summers as well. And just salad mix. If you have little mesclun misses, or our salad in Provence, our beautiful mixture of kind of mesclun and herbs, these are all wonderful things to succession sow. And oh yeah, here's that salad in Provence, so beautiful. Oh, and purslane. If you haven't tried purslane the weed, it's delicious. Oh, I forgot to mention in weed management, so many weeds are delicious, and I hope that you eat them. Lamb's quarters is like divine spinach, especially when it's less than 6 inches tall. There's so many. Let's talk about edible weeds very soon. Okay, deal. But purslane is a very delicious edible weed. This golden purslane is a slightly domesticated version, so it has a more bright lemon flavor, and it's very upright as opposed to classic weed purslane grows prostrate along the ground. And beets, critical to succession, so right there with carrots along across the seasons. And again, take a look at our planting calendar, because that'll have on here when you can direct sow, when you can transplant, when you can basically if it can be succession sown, the direct sow and transplant windows are much wider. And if they're really not ideal for succession sowing, they have a very brief window. So this calendar will show all those details. And continuing on our little succession sowing list, kohlrabi, phenomenal, especially in spring and fall for succession sowing. Watermelon radish is awesome. We really only grow one succession of them, but they're wonderful to sow like after we've lifted our garlic, for example. We will add some more compost to the soil, and we'll add our fall radishes. So yeah, think it's not only like, how do I eat lettuce the entire season, but after I harvest my garlic, what goes in there? After I harvest my onions, what goes in next? Things like this. And also, so squash, you can totally do multiple successions along with cucumbers. And kind of here in Zone 5, mid-July is kind of last call for that final succession. This Success PM, which is a powdery mildew resistant summer squash, is phenomenal, and it's 50 days to maturity. So you want to work back from your frost dates to make sure that you're accommodating and leaving plenty of space for that second succession to mature. And yes, peas, I wanted to mention, are my favorite way to finish off succession sowing for fall, because we plant them kind of in the beginning of August, and they're maturing just as it's starting to get cold, really cold, and that coldness makes the peas so much sweeter and so much more tender, and it's so heavenly. So yeah, you want to be sure that if you're succession sowing peas, that you're in fall, that you're only growing the dwarves. The dwarves only get 2.5 feet tall. They're much more quick to mature as opposed to this 5-6 foot full size peas. So if you're succession sowing peas for fall, only choose the dwarves. So there are a few thoughts for succession sowing, friends. Oh my goodness. And I don't think I mentioned, if you haven't already, check out our Rise and Shine Sowing Seeds with Ease, because take a look. There's this direct sowing chart, and there's just there's a transplant chart and tons of other awesome info. And you can actually get this as a free download on our website, and just here beneath the webinar as well. And so that way, the the free download. You can easily print it on your home printer, and it'll be black and white and not as many photographs, but it's still very serviceable. If you want the full color version with all the bells and whistles and beautiful photographs, we have them available on our website. I'd love to share them with you for purchase, and check it out. The next thing on my list to share about adaptive garden planning is to share the abundance, and then the final thing is how to take notes. So sharing abundance, let's just back it up for a moment. Our species has been cultivating, actively domesticating plants for over 10,000 years. It depends who you ask, and I agree with them. Really, they've been domesticating us for 10,000 years, for better and for worse. But for better and for worse, but mostly for the better, our ancestors loved us, and they loved to eat. And so they saved the seeds of the most delicious things they found, and they shared them with every generation yet to come. And we get to be good ancestors as well by growing these seeds and saving these seeds and sharing this abundance of peas, of knowledge of how to sow peas. And so this sharing is so much of what we're really cultivating, because gardens, I very deeply believe, grow us so much more than we grow them. So sharing the abundance, certainly of what you grow in terms of calories, but so far beyond calories. This is why I'm sitting here in our garden for over an hour sharing some thoughts on adaptive garden planning with you for free, because I love this, and it gives me so much joy to not only grow it, but mostly to then harvest it and share this food with people that I love, and then to share this wisdom and knowledge of how to grow it with you, so you can then go and share what you love with people that you love. And I think our species might be a little better for it the more that we share. And so, yes, share the abundance in all the ways, and it will amplify the abundance in all ways for all generations and all species to come. So finally, I just want to note about taking notes, because I have learned the hard way so many times that I just learned the hard way. And I learned something, but then I still start my tomatoes way too early. And oh yeah, I should really not start my tomatoes so early next year. But if I don't take really good notes, then I find myself looking at Instagram and thinking, oh my gosh, people are already starting their tomatoes. That means I'm late. And it's very easy, especially with social media these days, to be starting seeds way too soon, and just making other really common mistakes, and also really awesome, like light years ahead of what we would have learned on our own. So whether you're learning things through joy or through struggle, if you take notes of them, you will harvest that much more abundance in that many more ways. So check it out. We made this little planting calendar, and it's called Across the Seasons. And as a planting calendar, it is full of dates, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but not days of the week. Instead, there's sections for years. So here we're starting in 2020, and all kinds of things. So I have on here that we sowed beets and chard and kale outdoors on May 16th. I also have that the Eastern Phoebes hatched on the 19th of May. And so I'm listing all kinds of things on here, like when our final frost might be, when our final frost is, and when we start plants indoors, when we potted up our tomatoes. And so this will be this entire suite of information and really celebrations. We also have birthdays and other fun things, a section for it here. So it's very much how you can see what you're doing, and then you can learn across the seasons, see those emerging patterns, and take a look. In the back, there's this whole section called Let's Dig In, and it's this section for like, here's our notes on garlic, and here are my notes on tomatoes. So instead of looking through all the months and saying, oh yes, I did this, wait, I'm searching for all my tomato notes, I can go straight here as well and say, yeah, here's when I planted the tomatoes. And it's kind of your one-stop shop of crop by crop. So I'm so excited for you to dig in. And there's so many ways to take notes, right? This is just one. Certainly Dave, our amazing farm manager, we love you, Dave. He's so organized. He has extensive Excel spreadsheets with this information. There's so much to catalog. But honestly, you can keep it really simple, and keeping it simple and beautiful for you and fun for you is the way to actually make it effective for you. So however you do it, take some measure of notes if you possibly can bring yourself to. And if we can share this calendar with you and it surrounds you with that much more beauty and abundance, that is exactly why we made it, in fact. So I would love to share them with you, friends. And yeah, it also has our direct sowing chart and our transplanting chart inside it as well. And there's also at the bottom of each month, there are all these awesome little tips of what we're doing this month so that you can stay ahead of the curve, if at all possible, knowing that we're all learning all the time through both joy and struggle, and that it's all a really valid way to learn. So I want to finish up with two final thoughts. I remembered a really key thing that I forgot to say earlier about transplanting out that I would be remiss to not mention. So when transplanting, I love to either overhead water or dunk our transplants, just like this marvelous little, or this basil. Oh my gosh. I wish you could smell this basil. It's so heavenly. So we're going to dunk this basil, these beautiful soil blocks of basil, in dilute fish emulsion before we plant them. And that's because your plants are hungry and they're about to climb a mountain. And if you're about to climb a mountain, you want a big breakfast. And climbing the mountain of growing abundantly for the season to come, whoa, requires a lot of nutrients. And so dilute fish emulsion, you take 1 ounce of this fish emulsion concentrate, dilute it into 1 gallon of water, and then you could simply dunk the plants in, or you can overhead water, and that way they have plenty of water and plenty of nutrients, so they're fully inspired to grow readily and explore new soil, explore and absorb new nutrients. It's one of the best ways that you can set yourself and your transplants up for success. So pardon that little backdrop in time. And a final note. I am so grateful to share all of this information with you, and I hope that you share it widely with everyone that you know and love. And if you're hungry for more, there's lots of ways to stay in touch. So certainly Instagram, Facebook, if you don't already hang out with us there, hang out with us there for Fruition Seeds. And if you haven't already joined our email list, please join our email list. Every week I send out a beautiful organic garden email that has video tutorials and all kinds of tips, and they're always very relevant for what we're doing in our gardens now, and I don't take for granted that you're sharing your email with me. I try to make them as beautiful and as informative as I possibly can, and I take great pride in them. So join our email list. And I hope to share the farm with you one day. The farm is in Naples, New York. We're here in the Finger Lakes, an hour south of Rochester, and we have lots of events throughout the summer. And in normal springs, pandemic springs excluded, we're open on every weekend and Saturday and Sunday in April and in May. And we share seeds and transplants and all kinds of tools. And we have on-farm classes and tours. It's really beautiful and fun, and people come from all over. We also have all kinds of events throughout the summer, and whether they're tomato tastings, or I love our watermelon and the dahlias party, because we grow hundreds of organic watermelons every year just for the seeds inside. So come help us enjoy them. And then we grow thousands of dahlias as well. So by the end of August, when we're having our watermelon party, there are easily 10,000 dahlias blooming, and it's extraordinary. So watermelon and the dahlias, so many wonderful events that we have, and I can't wait to share them all with you here on the farm one day. There's a final way, another way that you can stay in touch, and that is our Flourish Garden Club. If you haven't already heard, Flourish is our online garden club, and it is so amazing. There are hundreds of members, and we have an online forum where you can post any question, photo, anytime, and there are hundreds of people there that, along with me, are going to be seeing and responding to your questions. It's a really amazing, really generous community. And we also have our Flourish archives that has hundreds, literally there's over 600 videos in it, and many of them are exclusive to Flourish, and they're everything about composting and companion planting and container gardening and seed starting and all kinds of things all across the board. And so it's really beautifully organized. And every week I also am updating it. So I'm sending out a weekly email for Flourish as well that has our most in-depth, most behind-the-scenes version of fruition seeds. And we also do live Q&A with Flourish every month, which I do live Q&As often on social media, but the Flourish ones are very concentrated and they're often much more personal and contemplative and deep and rich. So I'm so honored to share a free month of Flourish Garden Club with you for sitting through this hour, almost hour and a half with me. And so the promo code Let's Flourish, all one word, Let's Flourish, will give you a free month of Flourish Garden Club. It's $8 a month, and you can come and go at any time. And I would love for you to experience the in-depth deep dive of Flourish Garden Club if you would love to give it a try. So we do what we do because we love seeds, because we love to eat what they grow, because we love to share that food with people we love. So we do it all for you, everyone that we love. So thank you so much for being part of our Fruition family, for knowing that seeds are not as small as they seem, and for constantly adapting, growing ourselves as we grow our gardens and grow our communities and grow each other. Every day we are growing ourselves and growing the world that our grandchildren of all species will inherit. And so it's a privilege to become and learn how to constantly become better ancestors with you, friends. I'm at your service, and